The apple tree's sudden blooms sent a shiver through Sarah that had nothing to do with the October chill. She pressed her weathered palm against the cold window pane, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the impossible unfold before her eyes. The child, a boy who couldn't be more than 7, with skin the color of burnished copper and hair white as fresh snow, stepped back from the tree with the same eerie calm his siblings displayed. The blossoms glowed faintly in the dying light, their petals falling like benedictions onto the frost-killed grass below. "Thomas," Sarah called to her husband without turning from the window. "Thomas, you need to see this." But when she glanced back, Thomas remained slumped in his chair by the fireplace, the same position he'd held for 3 days now, his breathing so shallow she had to strain to see his chest rise and fall. The wasting sickness had taken hold of him just as it had taken the Hendersons' youngest boy, the Weatherby's eldest daughter, and half a dozen others in the past month. Dr. Fletcher from the county seat had no explanation, just shook his head and muttered about mountain ailments beyond modern medicine's reach. Sarah turned back to the window, but the street lay empty now. Only Martha Henderson's apple tree remained as proof that anything extraordinary had occurred, its impossible blossoms swaying in the evening breeze like ghosts dancing on their own graves. The front door of the Henderson house across the road swung open, and Martha herself appeared on the porch. Moving faster than Sarah had seen her move in months, the elderly woman approached her transformed tree with trembling hands, touching the bark with the reverence one might reserve for a holy relic. Even from this distance, Sarah could see the tears streaming down Martha's weathered cheeks. A soft knock at Sarah's own door made her jump. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. In Thornhaven, folks didn't call after sunset unless someone had died or was about to. The knock came again, patient but insistent. Sarah opened the door to find a child standing on her porch, a girl this time, with Asian features and eyes like polished obsidian. She wore a simple white dress despite the freezing air, her bare feet showing no signs of cold or discomfort. When she smiled, Sarah felt something deep in her chest unclench, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. "Mrs. Montgomery," the child said, her voice carrying an impossible depth, as if spoken by someone far older than her apparent years. "Your husband is in pain." It wasn't a question. Sarah's mouth went dry. "Who are you? May we help him?" Before Sarah could answer, the child stepped past her into the house, moving with the same fluid grace she'd observed in Kira. The girl approached Thomas's chair, and Sarah found herself frozen in the doorway, watching as the child placed small hands on her husband's burning forehead. The effect was immediate. Color returned to Thomas's hollow cheeks, and his breathing deepened. His eyes fluttered open for the first time in days, focusing with startling clarity on the strange child before him. "What?" Thomas began, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Rest now," the girl whispered, and Thomas's eyes drifted closed again, but this time in peaceful sleep rather than fevered delirium. Sarah felt her knees threaten to buckle. "How did you—" "The mountain taught us," the child replied, turning those ancient eyes toward Sarah. "There are old ways, older than your village, older than the fear that drives your people to cast out what they don't understand." "Is this about Kira?" Sarah managed to ask. "About what we did?" The child tilted her head, considering. "Kira remembers everything, Mrs. Montgomery. Every word spoken in hatred, every stone thrown in anger, every night she spent hungry and alone because your people decided her differences made her dangerous." Shame burned in Sarah's throat. She had been there that October night 8 years ago, when the council had gathered in the old church, their voices raised in accusation as rain pounded the roof like the fists of angry gods. She had said nothing when they blamed Kira for the failed harvest, for the livestock that had sickened and died, for every misfortune that had befallen their isolated community. She had remained silent when they told the 17-year-old girl that she was no longer welcome in the only home she'd ever known. "We were frightened," Sarah whispered, knowing how inadequate the words sounded. "And now?" the child asked, her obsidian eyes seeming to peer directly into Sarah's soul. "Are you still frightened?" Before Sarah could answer, the girl was gone, slipping out the door like mist dispersed by wind. Sarah rushed to the window again, but saw only empty streets and that impossible apple tree, its blossoms glowing faintly in the moonlight like stars fallen to earth. Behind her, Thomas stirred in his chair, murmuring her name in a voice clear and strong, a voice she'd thought she might never hear again. Sarah sank onto the arm of Thomas's chair, her hand finding his shoulder as she tried to process what had just occurred. His skin was warm beneath her touch, truly warm, not the fevered heat that had consumed him for days. The shallow, rattling breaths that had haunted her nights were replaced by the steady rhythm of natural sleep. "Thomas?" she whispered, not wanting to wake him, but needing confirmation that this wasn't some cruel dream born of exhaustion and desperation. His eyes opened, clear and focused in a way they hadn't been since the sickness took hold. "Sarah." His voice carried none of the weakness she'd grown accustomed to hearing. God help me, I feel like myself again." She pressed her forehead against his, relief flooding through her so completely that she began to shake. "That child, did you see what she did?" "I saw." Thomas struggled to sit up straighter, his movements still cautious, but no longer the painful shuffles of a dying man. Those eyes of hers, like looking into a well that goes down to the center of the earth. He paused, studying his wife's face in the firelight. "You know who she is, don't you? Who they all are?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak around the knot in her throat. She had recognized something in the way the girl moved, the particular tilt of her head when she listened. Echoes of Kira Blackwood, the stuttering girl they had driven away into a storm that should have killed her. "We need to tell the others," Thomas said, though his voice carried no enthusiasm for the task. "The council needs to know she's back. With 7 children who can heal the dying." Sarah stood and moved to the window again, drawn by some compulsion she couldn't name. The Henderson house was dark now, but the apple tree continued to glow with its impossible blossoms. "They'll call it witchcraft. And what would you call it?" The question hung between them like smoke. Sarah thought of Martha Henderson, who had spent the last month preparing for her husband's funeral, now likely watching him breathe easy for the first time since summer. She thought of the Weatherby girl, wasting away in her bed while her parents took turns keeping vigil. She thought of young Billy Henderson, who hadn't spoken above a whisper in weeks. "I'd call it a miracle," she said finally. "But you know how this town feels about miracles that come from the wrong source." Thomas rose from his chair with only a slight tremor in his legs, nothing like the convulsions that had racked him just hours before. He joined her at the window, slipping his arm around her waist with a strength that made her want to weep. "Do you remember what we said about her?" he asked quietly. "That night in the church?" Sarah closed her eyes. She remembered all of it with the crystal clarity reserved for the moments that define a life. Mayor Blackthorn's voice rising above the others as he catalogued their misfortunes. The crops that had failed despite perfect growing weather. The well at the Morrison place that had suddenly run dry. The string of stillbirths that had left 3 families childless. And Kira, standing in the center of it all, her stutter worse than ever as she tried to defend herself against accusations that made no logical sense but felt true in the way that fear always feels true. Sarah remembered her own voice joining the chorus, agreeing that the girl was somehow cursed, that her presence was poisoning their small community. "We said she was unnatural," Sarah whispered, "that God had marked her for a reason. And what if we were right?" Thomas's arm tightened around her. "What if she was marked, but not as a curse? What if we cast out our salvation because we were too frightened to see it clearly?" Before Sarah could respond, a sound drifted through the night air, laughter, pure and joyful, carrying the unmistakable cadence of children at play. They pressed closer to the window, watching as shadows moved between the houses across the road. 7 small figures danced in the pale moonlight, their movements fluid and synchronized, like performers who had rehearsed their steps for years. In their center stood a woman with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, her face turned upward toward the stars. Even at this distance, even after 8 years, Sarah would have known that silhouette anywhere. Kira Blackwood had come home. The woman turned toward Sarah's window, as if sensing her gaze, and even across the space between them, Sarah felt the weight of recognition. Kira raised one hand, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement, a gesture that said, "I see you. I remember you. I remember everything." Then she was moving again, herding her impossible children toward the old path that led up into the mountains. Within moments, they had vanished into the shadows between the trees, leaving behind only the glowing apple tree and the echo of children's laughter on the wind. "She's not staying in town," Thomas observed. Sarah nodded, understanding more than she could articulate. Whatever Kira had become during her 8 years away, she was not yet ready to walk the streets where they had once shamed her. But she was close enough to offer healing, close enough to remind them of what they had lost, close enough to make them wonder what she might ask for in return. The night stretched endlessly after Kira's departure, but sleep proved impossible. Sarah found herself moving restlessly through the house, checking on Thomas every few minutes as if his miraculous recovery might evaporate like morning mist. Each time she found him sleeping peacefully, his breathing steady and strong. Yet the gift of his healing felt fragile, something that could be snatched away as easily as it had been given. By dawn, word had spread through Thornhaven like wildfire. Sarah watched from her kitchen window as neighbors emerged from their homes, gathering in small clusters on the street. Their voices carried on the crisp morning air, fragments of wonder and terror intertwined. Martha Henderson stood beside her apple tree, now heavy with fruit that shouldn't exist in October, pressing ripe apples into the hands of anyone who would accept them. The sound of boots on her porch steps made Sarah's pulse quicken. Through the front window, she saw Mayor Blackthorne approaching with 3 council members in tow, their faces grim with purpose. Behind them trailed Dr. Fletcher, his medical bag clutched tight in white-knuckled hands. Thomas appeared at her shoulder, fully dressed and moving with none of yesterday's frailty. "They'll want answers we don't have," he murmured. Sarah opened the door before they could knock. "Gentlemen." "Mrs. Montgomery." Mayor Blackthorne's weathered face was harder than usual, his gray eyes cold as winter stone. "We need to speak with your husband." "Thomas is much improved," Sarah replied carefully, not stepping aside to let them in. "Dr. Fletcher, perhaps you'd like to examine him?" The doctor pushed forward eagerly, his instruments already in hand. But when he approached Thomas, his confident stride faltered. The man before him bore little resemblance to the patient he'd examined just 3 days prior, the hollow-eyed, fever-racked figure who'd been hours from death. "This is impossible," Dr. Fletcher whispered, checking Thomas's pulse, his temperature peering into his eyes with growing bewilderment. "The wasting sickness doesn't simply disappear overnight." "Apparently it does," Thomas said mildly. Mayor Blackthorne stepped forward, his bulk filling the doorway. "We know what happened here last night, Montgomery. The whole town's talking about it. Strange children. Impossible healings." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Kira Blackwood." The name hung in the air like a curse word spoken in church. Sarah saw the fear in their faces, the same fear that had driven them to cast out a stuttering girl 8 years ago, amplified now by the evidence of powers they couldn't understand or control. "She saved my husband's life," Sarah said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Whatever else you want to call it, that's what happened." "Witchcraft," spat Councilman Pierce, a thin man whose farm had failed 3 seasons running. "Devil's work, more like." "You think salvation comes without a price?" Dr. Fletcher was still examining Thomas, his movements growing more frantic with each impossible finding. His white blood cell count should be depleted. His organs should be shutting down. According to every medical principle I know, this man should be dying. He looked up, his face pale. Instead, he's healthier than men half his age. "Then perhaps," Thomas said quietly, "your medical principles don't account for everything that exists in these mountains." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of unease through the assembled men. Mayor Blackthorne's face darkened. "You sound like you're defending her." "I'm stating facts," Thomas replied. "My wife told you what happened. A child came to our door and healed me. Whatever your feelings about Kira Blackwood, can you honestly say that's evil? The Morrison girl woke up this morning speaking for the first time in 2 months, Dr. Fletcher said suddenly, his voice hollow. The Weatherby boy is asking for breakfast. Martha Henderson's husband is splitting firewood in his backyard. He looked around the circle of men, his scientific worldview crumbling before their eyes. Half the sick in this town have recovered overnight. Mayor Blackthorn's jaw worked silently for a moment. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of old fear and older shame. She was 17 years old when we sent her away. Just a girl with a stutter and strange dreams. Now she comes back with powers that defy God's natural order, bringing 7 children that aren't quite human. He leaned closer to Thomas. What do you think she learned out there in the darkness? What do you think she wants from us? It was the question that had haunted Sarah through the sleepless night. The girl they had cast out had been powerless, defenseless against their collective cruelty. The woman who had returned possessed abilities that could heal their dying, or perhaps ensure their destruction. Maybe, Sarah heard herself saying, we should ask her. The suggestion fell like a thunderclap among the men. Mayor Blackthorn's face flushed red. You want to invite her back? After what we know she's capable of? We drove her away once, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. Look how that served us. Our crops have failed for 3 straight years. The wasting sickness has taken 8 of our children. We're dying by degrees, Mayor. All of us. She gestured toward the Henderson house, where impossible fruit hung heavy on autumn branches. She could save us. The question is, do we have the courage to let her? The silence that followed Sarah's words stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with the weight of unspoken fears. Mayor Blackthorn's face cycled through shades of red as he struggled with the implications of what she'd suggested. Behind him, the council members shifted uneasily, their gazes darting between the Hendersons' miraculous apple tree and Thomas's impossible recovery. Courage? Mayor Blackthorn's voice cracked like a whip. You call it courage to invite the devil back to our doorstep? But even as he spoke, Sarah could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. The same doubt that had kept her awake all night, wrestling with questions that had no clean answers. Dr. Fletcher continued his examination of Thomas with increasingly frantic movements, as if hoping to find some rational explanation hidden in the miracle of restored health. John, Thomas said quietly, addressing the mayor by his first name in a way that made the older man stiffen. Your grandson's been coughing blood for 2 weeks. The color drained from Blackthorn's face. That's not your concern, isn't it? Thomas stood slowly, testing his strength. We're all connected in this place. Your pain, my pain, Kira's pain. We pretend otherwise, but every decision we make ripples through this community like stones thrown in still water. He paused, studying the mayor's weathered features. Little Jamie's only 7 years old, same age as some of those children who came last night. Sarah watched her husband with growing admiration and terror. The Thomas who had emerged from his healing was not quite the same man who had been dying in that chair. There was something sharper about him now, more direct, as if proximity to the impossible had burned away his tolerance for comfortable lies. You don't understand, Councilman Pierce interjected, his thin voice trembling. What she's become, it's not natural. Those children, they don't cast shadows properly. They don't breathe like normal folks. Mary Hutchins saw them walking past her window at midnight, and she swears their feet never touched the ground. Mary Hutchins also swore she saw the ghost of her dead husband washing dishes last winter, Dr. Fletcher muttered, though his scientific skepticism sounded hollow even to his own ears. Sarah found herself stepping forward, drawn into a conversation that felt like standing at the edge of a precipice. What if we're asking the wrong questions? She said slowly. Instead of wondering what she's become, maybe we should ask what we drove her to become. The words tasted bitter in her mouth, seasoned with 8 years of guilt she'd tried to bury. She remembered Kira's face that last night, not the confident woman who'd returned with 7 impossible children, but the terrified girl who'd stood before them in the old church, her stutter so bad she could barely form words to defend herself. She was different, Mayor Blackthorn said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Even before the trouble started, she was strange. She was gifted, Sarah corrected, the words coming from some deep well of honesty she hadn't known she possessed. We were too frightened to see the difference. Thomas moved to stand beside his wife, his presence solid and warm, alive in a way she'd feared she'd never feel again. Fear makes cowards of us all, John, makes us cast out what we don't understand instead of trying to learn from it. Dr. Fletcher finally looked up from his instruments, his face pale with the exhaustion of a man whose worldview had crumbled overnight. The question isn't whether she's dangerous, he said quietly. The question is whether we can afford to turn her away again. Afford? Pierce's voice rose to a near shriek. What about our souls? What about Jamie Blackthorne? Thomas interrupted. What about the Weatherby girl who was dying yesterday and is eating breakfast this morning? What about every child in this town who might not live to see Christmas if we let our pride make the choice for us? Mayor Blackthorne's shoulders seemed to cave inward, the weight of his position suddenly visible in the slope of his spine. Sarah could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the battle between the leader who needed to protect his people and the grandfather who was watching his own blood waste away. If we approach her, he said finally, each word dragged from him like a confession, what's to stop her from taking revenge? We cast her out, Sarah. We took everything from her. A girl with that kind of power, what's to stop her from making us pay for what we did? It was the question that had haunted Sarah's sleepless hours, the fear that made her hands shake even as she watched impossible fruit ripen on autumn trees. Kira Blackwood had returned with the power to heal, but with healing came its shadow twin, the ability to harm, and they had given her every reason to choose the darker path. Maybe, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, we find out what it costs to find out. The words hung in the morning air like a challenge thrown down before the gods themselves. Sarah felt their weight settling over the assembled men, saw the moment when possibility shifted into inevitability. There would be no more debate, no more circling around the truth they all knew but feared to speak. Someone would have to climb the mountain path. Someone would have to face what they had made of Kira Blackwood. I'll go. The declaration escaped Sarah's lips before conscious thought could stop it. The men turned toward her with expressions of shock, but she felt only a strange sense of relief, as if she'd finally stopped fighting a current that had been pulling at her since the moment she'd seen those impossible children dancing in the moonlight. Sarah, no. Thomas reached for her arm, but she stepped away, her decision crystallizing with each heartbeat. It has to be me. The certainty in her own voice surprised her. I was there that night. I spoke against her. If anyone in this town has the right to ask for her mercy, it's someone who has the courage to admit they were wrong. Mayor Blackthorne's face had gone ashen. You don't understand what you're suggesting. Those children, what if they're not children at all? What if she's become something that only wears a human face? Then I'll find out. Sarah moved toward the door, but Thomas caught her wrist this time, his grip gentle but firm. You won't go alone, he said quietly. She turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same terrifying resolution that was burning in her chest. Thomas, you just recovered. You can't. I can, and I will. His voice carried an edge of steel she'd never heard before, as if his brush with death had stripped away every pretense except truth. She saved my life. If there's a price to be paid for that gift, I'll be the one to pay it. Dr. Fletcher cleared his throat, his medical bag trembling in his hands. I should come as well. If there are more healings to be done, if there's something to be learned about how she… No, the refusal came from Mayor Blackthorne, sharp and final. If this is happening, it happens with as few people as possible. We don't parade up that mountain like we're bringing her tribute. Sarah felt a laugh bubble up in her throat, bitter as burnt coffee. Isn't that exactly what we're doing? The question silenced them all, because it was tribute, in a way, an offering of humility from a town that had spent 8 years choking on its own pride. They were going to lay their desperation at the feet of the girl they'd cast out and hope she was merciful enough to save them despite their cruelty. When? Thomas asked. Sarah looked toward the mountains, where morning mist clung to the peaks like ghostly fingers. Somewhere up there, among the ancient trees and hidden hollows, Kira Blackwood waited with her 7 impossible children. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt only a strange anticipation, as if she were finally moving towards something she'd been avoiding her entire life. "Now," she said, "before we lose our nerve, before we talk ourselves into believing we can solve this any other way." Mayor Blackthorne ran a hand through his gray hair, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "If she kills you, she won't." Sarah's certainty surprised even herself. She had every chance for revenge last night. She could have let Thomas die, could have let all of them die. Instead, she sent healing. She paused, remembering the weight of recognition in that distant gaze. "She's not the same frightened girl we drove away, but she's not a monster either." Thomas squeezed her hand, his touch warm and alive. "We go together. We face this together." Sarah nodded, feeling the last of her old life falling away like leaves in autumn wind. The woman who had spent 8 years pretending that night in the church hadn't happened was gone. In her place stood someone willing to walk into the unknown, to cross whatever threshold waited on the mountain path. They gathered what they could: water, simple food, a lantern for the journey down. Sarah changed into her sturdiest boots and warmest coat, each preparation feeling like ritual, like preparation for a pilgrimage she should have begun years ago. As they stepped onto the mountain path, Sarah felt the village's eyes upon them. Faces pressed to windows, neighbors gathered in doorways. Word would spread quickly through Thornhaven. The Montgomerys had gone to find Kira Blackwood. They had crossed the threshold from safety into mystery, from known fear into uncertain hope. Behind them, the Hendersons' apple tree swayed in the morning breeze, heavy with fruit that defied every natural law. Ahead lay shadows and secrets, and somewhere among them a reckoning 8 years in the making. There was no going back now. The mountain path wound upward through stands of oak and hickory, their leaves painted in autumn's fierce palette. Sarah's breath came in visible puffs as they climbed, the October air sharp with the promise of winter. Beside her, Thomas moved with surprising strength, his recent recovery evident in every confident step. But Sarah could feel the weight of their undertaking pressing down like gathering storm clouds. They had been walking for an hour when they encountered the first sign that they were entering something beyond the ordinary world. The trees here grew differently, taller, straighter, their bark marked with spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when observed directly. Thomas noticed it first, his hand instinctively reaching for Sarah's arm. "Look at the shadows," he whispered. Sarah followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. The shadows beneath the strange trees didn't align with the sun's position. They fell at impossible angles, creating pockets of darkness that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. More disturbing still, she could swear she saw movement within those shadows. Quick flickers of motion that vanished the moment she tried to focus on them. "We're being watched," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Thomas nodded grimly. "Have been for the last 10 minutes. Something's pacing us through the trees." They continued climbing, their footsteps muffled by a carpet of leaves that made no sound when disturbed. The very air seemed different here, thicker somehow, charged with an energy that made Sarah's skin prickle. She found herself remembering the old stories her grandmother had told, tales of thin places where the world grew strange and ancient powers still stirred. The path curved around a massive boulder, and they found themselves face to face with their first test. 3 children stood blocking the way ahead, not the 7 from the night before, but others. A girl who might have been 10 years old, with silver hair that moved like water and eyes the color of deep forest pools. Beside her, twin boys whose skin held an odd translucent quality, as if they were carved from moonlight. All 3 regarded the approaching adults with expressions of ancient wisdom that belonged on no child's face. "You seek the Thornkeeper," the girl said, her voice carrying harmonics that made Sarah's bones vibrate. It wasn't a question. Thomas stepped slightly forward, his posture protective but not aggressive. "We seek Kira Blackwood. We come to speak with her." The silver-haired child tilted her head, studying them with unblinking intensity. "Names from the before time. The Thornkeeper has grown beyond such limitations." She paused, and Sarah felt that penetrating gaze sweep over her like physical touch. You carry guilt, woman of the valley. It bleeds from you like perfume. Sarah found her voice, though it emerged rougher than intended. I carry truth. We wronged her, all of us. I've come to acknowledge that. One of the twin boys spoke, his words seeming to come from everywhere at once. Truth is sharp medicine. Not all survive the taking of it. Some wounds can only heal when they're acknowledged, Sarah replied, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. I'd rather die honest than live with the lie we've been telling ourselves. The children exchanged glances that held entire conversations. Sarah had the unsettling impression that they were communicating in ways that transcended speech, their consciousness flowing between them like water between vessels. Finally, the girl stepped aside, gesturing toward a narrow path that branched off from the main trail. The Thornkeeper will see you, but know this, the rules change beyond this point. Time flows differently where she dwells. What you were in the valley below matters less than what you choose to become in the spaces between. As they followed the indicated path, Sarah felt reality shift around them like fabric being rewoven. The trees grew more massive with each step, their canopy so dense that the sky became a distant memory. Phosphorescent moss clung to the bark, providing an eerie blue-green glow that turned their faces ghostly pale. Sarah Thomas's voice held a note of warning. Look at our footprints. She glanced back and felt her heart skip. Their tracks in the soft earth were filling with luminous mist, as if the ground itself were absorbing their passage and transforming it into something else. More unsettling still, she could see other prints alongside their own, bare feet that hadn't been there moments before, as if invisible companions were matching their steps. The path descended into a hollow she couldn't remember seeing from below, a natural amphitheater carved from living stone and root. At its center stood a structure that defied architectural logic, part tree, part dwelling, its walls formed from interwoven branches that pulsed with gentle bioluminescence. 7 tall figures moved in the shadows around its perimeter, too distant to make out clearly but unmistakably present. And there, seated on a throne carved from a single massive root, was Kira Blackwood. She looked up as they approached, and Sarah felt 8 years of guilt and fear crystallize into a single moment of reckoning. The woman on the root throne bore little resemblance to the stuttering girl who had fled Thornhaven 8 years ago. Kira's dark hair flowed like liquid shadow around shoulders, wrapped in a cloak that seemed woven from starlight and moss. Her face had gained sharp angles that spoke of power claimed rather than granted, and when she smiled, an expression that held no warmth, Sarah saw teeth that gleamed too white in the phosphorescent glow. Sarah Montgomery, Kira said, her voice carrying the same impossible harmonics as the children. And Thomas, how fitting that you should come to me together, as you stood together that night in the church. Thomas stepped forward, his jaw set with determination. We came to thank you for what you did, for saving my life. Kira's laugh was like wind chimes made of ice. Did I save you, Thomas? Or did I simply delay the inevitable? Death comes to all things in the valley below. Here, time moves differently. Here, debts accumulate interest. Sarah felt her courage wavering as those ancient eyes fixed upon her. This was not the reunion she had imagined during the climb, no tearful reconciliation or grateful acceptance of apology. The woman before her radiated power like heat from a forge, and beneath that power lay something that might have been hunger. I came to tell you I was wrong, Sarah managed, her voice sounding small in the vast hollow. We all were. What we did to you. What you did, Kira interrupted, rising from her throne with fluid grace, was reveal your true nature. Fear wrapped in righteousness. Cruelty disguised as protection. She began to move around them in a slow circle, and Sarah noticed that her feet cast no shadow on the luminous ground. Tell me, Sarah, when you cast your vote that night, did you believe you were saving the town? Or were you simply eliminating something that made you uncomfortable? The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah wanted to claim noble motives, to insist that fear for the community had driven her actions. But standing in this place where reality bent like heated metal, surrounded by impossible children and faced with a power that could see through every comfortable lie, only truth seemed possible. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of you. Afraid of what you represented." "Change," Kira said, nodding with something that might have been approval. "Growth beyond the comfortable boundaries of your small world. Yes, you were afraid. And in your fear, you chose to cut away what you couldn't understand rather than learn from it." Thomas moved closer to his wife, his presence an anchor of warmth in the supernatural chill. "We can't undo what was done. But we're here now. That has to count for something." Kira paused in her circling, tilting her head as she studied him. "You're different, Thomas. The healing changed you. You can feel it, can't you? The way the world has become more. Colors brighter, sounds deeper, as if you'd been living behind glass and only now stepped into the true air." Sarah saw her husband's face pale with recognition. "What did you do to me?" "I offered you a choice," Kira replied. "Life or death. You chose life. But every choice has consequences. Every gift demands payment." Her smile grew sharper. "The question now is what you're willing to pay." One of the tall figures in the shadows stepped forward, resolving into the shape of a teenage boy with bark-like skin and eyes that glowed like embers. "The Thornkeeper speaks truth," he said in a voice like rustling leaves. "The valley below withers because its people have forgotten the old agreements. The land sickens when the compact is broken." Sarah felt pieces clicking together in her mind like gears in an ancient machine. "You're talking about the drought, the failing crops. You're saying that's connected to what happened to you." "Everything is connected," Kira said simply. "The earth remembers every kindness, every cruelty. It responds accordingly." She gestured toward the living walls of her strange dwelling, where flowers bloomed in impossible profusion. "Here, where I am valued, life flourishes. There, where I was cast out." "You're punishing them," Thomas said, his voice tight with realization. "The whole town is suffering because of what a few people decided 8 years ago." Kira's expression didn't change, but the air around them grew noticeably colder. "I am not punishing anyone, Thomas. I am simply absent. The land that rejected its caretaker must learn to tend itself." Sarah felt the weight of revelation settling over her like a shroud. They hadn't just cast out a frightened girl. They had broken some fundamental bond between the community and the forces that sustained it. The drought, the sickness, the slow decay that had been eating at Thornhaven, all of it stemmed from that night in the church when fear had triumphed over wisdom. "What do you want from us?" she asked, though part of her already feared the answer. Kira's smile became something predatory and beautiful. "The same thing I've always wanted, Sarah, to come home." The words hung in the phosphorescent air like a curse made manifest. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice water as the implications crashed over her. Home. Kira wanted to come home to the town that had driven her away, but she was no longer the powerless girl they had cast out. She was something else now, something that commanded impossible children and bent reality to her will. "What does that mean?" Sarah's voice cracked on the question. "Coming home?" Kira stepped closer, and Sarah could see her own reflection multiplied in those ancient eyes, distorted, fragmented, showing her faces she didn't recognize. "It means taking my rightful place. It means the people of Thornhaven acknowledging what they destroyed and accepting what I've become in its place." Thomas moved protectively in front of his wife, though Sarah could see his hands trembling. "The town isn't yours to take, isn't it?" Kira's laugh was like breaking glass. "I was born there, raised there. My family bled and died for that land for generations. What gives any of you more claim than me?" Her voice rose, and the very air seemed to vibrate with her anger. "You cast me out not because I was dangerous, but because I was different, because I stuttered and saw things others couldn't see and made you uncomfortable with your small, frightened lives." The 7 tall figures in the shadows began to move closer, and Sarah realized with horror that they weren't entirely human. One had skin like polished stone, another's hair moved like living flame. They were beautiful and terrible, and their eyes held the same ancient intelligence as Kira's impossible children. "The old compact is broken," the one with bark skin repeated, his voice carrying undertones of wind through deep forests. The Thornkeeper was cast from her place. The land suffers. The people suffer. Balance must be restored. Sarah's mind raced, trying to understand the scope of what she was facing. This wasn't just about Kira's return. It was about something fundamental, something that connected the town's survival to forces she had never imagined existed. "The children," she said suddenly, the pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. "The ones who came down to heal people. They're not entirely human, are they?" Kira tilted her head, studying Sarah with something that might have been approval. "Very good. No, they're not. They're what grows when someone like me finds sanctuary in places like this. When the barriers between worlds grow thin and new possibilities take root." Thomas stepped backward, pulling Sarah with him, but the circle of otherworldly beings had closed around them. There was nowhere to retreat. "What do you want from the town? From us?" "Acknowledgement," Kira said simply. "Acceptance. The formal restoration of my place as Thornhaven's Thornkeeper, the role my family held for 3 centuries before fear made cowards of you all." Her expression softened slightly, but the power radiating from her never diminished. "The land is dying, Thomas. Your crops fail, your wells run dry, your children sicken with ailments that have no earthly cure. How much longer do you think Thornhaven can survive without the old protections?" Sarah felt the weight of impossible choice settling on her shoulders. Everything Kira said was true. The town was dying by inches, had been dying since that night 8 years ago. But accepting this creature as their guardian meant acknowledging powers that challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. "And if we refuse?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Kira's smile returned, sharp as winter wind. "Then you continue as you have been, struggling against forces you don't understand, watching everything you love wither and fade. I won't actively harm Thornhaven. That would be beneath me now. But neither will I save it from the consequences of its own choices." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken threats and impossible demands. Sarah could feel Thomas beside her, his newfound vitality warring with his fundamental decency. Whatever Kira had done to heal him, it had changed him in ways that went deeper than physical recovery. "You're asking us to choose between survival and, what, our souls?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm asking you to choose between fear and wisdom," Kira corrected. "Between the comfortable lie that you can control forces beyond your understanding and the difficult truth that some powers must be respected rather than conquered." She gestured to the thriving life around them, the impossible garden that bloomed in defiance of season and logic. "I learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Now you must learn it too." Thomas squeezed Sarah's hand, and she felt his decision crystallizing alongside her own terror. They had climbed this mountain seeking redemption, but what they'd found was something far more complex, a reckoning that would reshape not just their own lives, but the very nature of the community they called home. "How long do we have?" Thomas asked quietly. Kira's eyes glittered in the phosphorescent gloom. 3 days. Return to your people. Share what you've learned. Let them choose freely, with full knowledge of what they face." Her smile became something beautiful and terrible. "Then we'll see how much Thornhaven values its survival." The descent from Kira's domain felt like falling through layers of fractured reality. With each step down the mountain, Sarah felt the weight of impossible knowledge pressing against her skull like a tumor of truth too large for her mind to contain. Beside her, Thomas moved with the unnatural grace his healing had granted him, but his face was gray with the burden of what they had learned. They didn't speak until they reached the edge of Thornhaven, where the first dying cornfields stretched like a testament to their collective failure. Only then did Sarah find her voice, and it emerged as a broken whisper. "How do we tell them?" Thomas stopped walking, his enhanced senses clearly picking up sounds and scents that remained hidden from her. "We tell them the truth, that we broke something 8 years ago, and now we have to decide if we're willing to pay the price to fix it." But when they reached the town square, they found chaos waiting for them. A crowd had gathered around the church steps, their voices raised in angry confusion. At the center of the commotion, Elder Davies stood with his arms spread wide. his weathered face twisted with fury and fear. "Abomination!" he was shouting. "Ungodly creatures walking among us, touching our children with their demon magic." Sarah pushed through the crowd, her heart sinking as she realized what must have happened. There, huddled against the church wall, were three of Kira's impossible children, the same ones who had been healing the sick just days before. But now their otherworldly nature was impossible to hide. One child's silver hair moved like liquid mercury in the still air, while another's skin showed the translucent quality that marked them as something beyond human understanding. "They came looking for you?" Martha Hendricks called out when she spotted Sarah and Thomas. Said the thorn keeper sent them to prepare the way. "What did you do up there?" Before Sarah could answer, Elder Davies's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. "I knew it. I knew that woman would bring nothing but corruption back to our town." His wild gaze fixed on the cowering children, and Sarah saw something terrible building in his expression. "Demon spawn. Creatures of darkness sent to poison our souls." "No," Sarah said, stepping forward, but her voice was lost in the rising tide of the crowd's fear. Davies pulled something from beneath his coat, a bottle filled with clear liquid that caught the dying sunlight like captured fire. Even from a distance, Sarah could smell the sharp tang of accelerant. "We cleansed this place as we should have cleansed it years ago." Time slowed to a crystalline crawl. Sarah watched in horror as Davies raised the bottle, saw the crowd's fear transform into something uglier, more primal. The children pressed closer together, their ancient eyes wide with an emotion she had never expected to see there: terror. Not for themselves, but for what their destruction would mean. "You don't understand," Sarah screamed, lunging forward. "They're trying to help us. Without them, without her, we'll all—" Davies's arm swept down. The bottle shattered against the church steps, and liquid fire spread like a hungry thing seeking prey. The children cried out in voices that harmonized with frequencies beyond human hearing, a sound that made the very air weep. And then Thomas was there, moving with speed that defied nature, his body placing itself between the flames and the children. But the fire that touched him wasn't ordinary flame. It burned with the same supernatural intensity that powered Kira's magic, and Sarah watched in horror as her husband's enhanced flesh began to smoke and char. "Thomas!" She reached for him, but the heat drove her back, singeing her eyebrows and filling her lungs with the acrid taste of burning hope. The children's screams cut off abruptly. When the smoke cleared, they were gone. Not dead, but simply absent, as if reality had folded around them and carried them away. Only scorch marks on the stone steps remained, black wounds that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. Thomas collapsed, his borrowed vitality bleeding away like water through broken stone. As Sarah knelt beside him, cradling his burned and broken form, she felt something fundamental tear inside her chest. Not just her heart, though that was shattered beyond repair, but something deeper, the fragile hope she had carried down from the mountain, the possibility that redemption might still be possible, crumbled to ash in her hands. Elder Davies stood over them, his face flushed with righteous satisfaction. "Let this be a lesson," he declared to the gathering crowd. "We will not bow to demons, no matter how they disguise their evil." The crowd began to disperse, their fear temporarily satisfied by violence, but Sarah remained kneeling in the street, holding her dying husband while the mountain loomed above them like a dark judgment. 3 days, Kira had said. 3 days to choose between survival and destruction. But looking at Thomas's pain-twisted face, feeling the supernatural burns that were already claiming his enhanced life, Sarah realized the choice had already been made for them. The town had spoken with fire and hatred, just as they had 8 years ago, and this time there would be no mercy. The scorch marks on the church steps continued to pulse like infected wounds as Sarah cradled Thomas's failing body. His breath came in ragged gasps, each exhalation carrying whispers of the unnatural vitality that was bleeding away through his burns. The crowd had dispersed, leaving them alone with their devastation and Elder Davies's satisfied righteousness. But as the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, Sarah heard something that made her blood freeze, a sound like wind through deep caves, carrying voices that spoke in harmonies no human throat could produce. The remaining townspeople heard it too, their hurried footsteps faltering as the otherworldly chorus filled the air. Kira emerged from the shadows between buildings as if she had always been there, waiting. But this was not the controlled presence Sarah had encountered in the mountain hollow. This Kira moved like a force of nature barely contained within human form, her perfect features carved from winter itself. Behind her walked figures that made the impossible children seem mundane by comparison, beings whose very existence challenged the foundations of reality. "You made your choice," Kira said, her voice carrying undertones that made the church bells shiver in their tower. She looked down at Thomas's burned form, and for a moment, something almost human flickered in her ancient eyes. "I offered healing. You answered with fire." Sarah tried to speak, to explain that this wasn't what she had wanted, but the words died in her throat as understanding crashed over her like an avalanche of terrible clarity. The children's screams hadn't been fear, they had been warning, a call to their creator that the compact was not just broken, but actively violated, that the people of Thornhaven had chosen violence over mercy, destruction over redemption. 8 years ago, Kira continued, beginning to circle them with predatory grace, you cast out a frightened girl who stuttered and saw too much. Tonight, you attack children who came offering the very salvation you claim to need. She stopped directly in front of Elder Davies, who stood frozen with his empty bottle still clutched in his trembling hands. "Tell me, Elder, do you see a pattern?" Davies opened his mouth, but only a strangled croak emerged. The supernatural fire he had wielded was beginning to turn inward, Sarah realized with growing horror. The accelerant that had burned Kira's children was eating at him from the inside, consuming the righteousness that had fueled his actions. But it was Thomas who broke the silence that followed, his voice barely a whisper against Sarah's ear. "She's not here for revenge." His enhanced perception, even as it faded, had seen something the rest of them missed. "She's here for truth." Sarah looked up sharply, and suddenly the pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place with sickening precision. The drought, the failing crops, the children who never aged, never ate, never seemed quite real. Kira's references to old compacts and forgotten agreements, the way the mountain itself seemed to bend around her will. "You're not human," Sarah breathed, the realization hitting her like physical blow. "You never were." Kira smiled, and for the first time since her return, the expression held genuine warmth. "Very good, Sarah. No, I'm not. Neither was my mother, or her mother before her. We were the Thornkeepers, guardians of the balance between your world and the older powers that still move beneath it." Her form began to shift subtly, revealing glimpses of something far more ancient than the 17-year-old girl they had cast out. "For 3 centuries, my family maintained the agreements that kept this valley fertile and protected. We were the bridge between human fear and elemental truth." The crowd that had begun to reform around them stepped back in collective terror, but Sarah found herself leaning forward, hungry for understanding. "The stuttering, the things you saw, that wasn't disability, it was translation. 2 languages existing in one throat," Kira confirmed. "Human speech and the older tongue that speaks to stone and stream and growing things. Your ancestors understood this, they honored it. But understanding died with time, and by the time I manifested my full nature, you had forgotten what you were seeing." Thomas's grip on Sarah's hand tightened with desperate strength. "The children you brought back, they're not your offspring. They're my translation of human need into forms the old powers can comprehend," Kira said. "Each one a different aspect of what Thornhaven requires to survive: healing, growth, protection, renewal." Her voice turned cold as mountain wind, but translation requires trust, cooperation. You chose fire instead. Elder Davies finally found his voice, though it emerged cracked and hollow. "We were protecting ourselves from abomination." "You were protecting yourselves from change," Kira corrected, "from growth, from the uncomfortable truth that your survival has always depended on forces you neither control nor understand." She gestured toward the dying fields that surrounded them. "How is that protection serving you now?" Sarah felt the weight of absolute choice settling over the town like a judgment. They stood at the crossroads between extinction and acceptance, between the comfortable lie of human supremacy and the terrifying truth of interdependence. Looking at Thomas's fading life, at the scorch marks that pulsed with supernatural fire, at the mountain that loomed above them like a patient giant, she finally understood what redemption would actually cost. Everything they thought they knew about themselves. The weight of revelation pressed down on Thornhaven like the calm before a devastating storm. Sarah felt something crystallize within her as she knelt beside Thomas's failing form, his enhanced life bleeding away through burns that pulsed with their own malevolent rhythm. The choice Kira demanded wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation so fundamental it would remake their very souls. "Help him," Sarah said quietly, her voice cutting through the supernatural tension that held the crowd frozen. "Please." He tried to protect them. Kira studied her with those ancient eyes, weighing something Sarah couldn't fathom. Then, with fluid grace that spoke of powers beyond human understanding, she knelt beside Thomas. Her fingers hovered over his burns, and Sarah watched the unnatural fire begin to dim, drawn back into whatever realm had birthed it. "This will cost him," Kira said softly. "The healing I can offer now goes deeper than flesh. It will change him permanently, make him something between what he was and what I am." Her gaze met Sarah's. "Are you prepared for that price?" Sarah looked at her husband's pain-twisted features, then at the terrified faces surrounding them. Elder Davies stood frozen, the supernatural fire beginning to consume him from within. The crowd wavered between flight and fascination, caught in the gravity of forces they had tried to destroy. Everything balanced on a knife's edge of choice. "Yes," she whispered. Kira's touch transformed Thomas's burns into something else. Not scars, but patterns that traced his skin like living silver. His breathing steadied, but when his eyes opened, they held depths that hadn't existed before. He was still himself, but he was also something more. A bridge, like Kira had been before they broke her. "Thank you," Thomas said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air shimmer. He understood now, Sarah realized. Not just intellectually, but in his bones, his blood, his transformed essence. He had become part of the solution they so desperately needed. Rising to her feet, Sarah turned to face the crowd. Some had fled during Kira's healing, but others remained. Martha Hendricks, young Jake Morrison, the Brennan family with their sick daughter. People who had seen enough dying to recognize salvation when it stood before them, regardless of its terrifying form. "We have 2 days," Sarah announced, her voice carrying further than it should have in the thin mountain air. 2 days to decide whether we want to survive or maintain our comfortable lives." She gestured toward the dying fields, the empty sky that hadn't seen rain in months. "Look around you. Look at what our fear has bought us." Elder Davies made a choking sound, and Sarah turned to see the supernatural fire finally consuming his righteousness. But instead of destroying him, the flames were burning away something else, the rigid certainty that had driven him to violence. When they faded, he stood diminished but somehow cleaner, his face slack with newfound understanding. "I felt it," he whispered. "When the fire touched me, I felt what they felt, what she felt." His gaze found Kira with something like wonder. 8 years of pain, 8 years of watching us die by inches while you waited for us to remember what we were supposed to be. Kira inclined her head with grave dignity. "Understanding is the first step toward redemption, Elder, but it's only the first." Thomas struggled to his feet, his new nature making him steady despite his ordeal. "What do you need from us? Specifically, not philosophy or ancient history, practical steps." For the first time since her return, Kira's expression showed something approaching relief. Here, finally, was someone willing to engage with solutions rather than problems. Acknowledgement of what I am and what this valley requires to survive. A formal restoration of the compact between Thornhaven and the powers that sustain it. And trust, the hardest gift of all. Sarah felt the pieces of a plan beginning to form. Not just acceptance, but active participation. Not just survival, but genuine partnership with forces they had spent generations trying to deny. You'll need advocates, she said. People who can help the others understand, who can speak for you when fear threatens to overwhelm reason. Yes. Kira's smile held the first warmth Sarah had seen from her. Translators. Bridges between what was and what must be. Thomas nodded slowly, his transformed senses clearly picking up currents of possibility that remained hidden from ordinary perception. We'll need to start with the children, the ones who are sick, whose parents have already seen what healing looks like. Build trust slowly, carefully. And the fields, Sarah added, her mind racing through practical applications. Demonstrate the restoration. Let people see their land coming back to life. Around them, the remaining townspeople began to shift, their body language changing from fearful rigidity to cautious interest. Not acceptance yet, but the beginning of possibility. The seed of hope that perhaps extinction wasn't their only choice. 2 days to reshape everything they thought they knew about themselves. 2 days to choose transformation over destruction. As the mountain shadows lengthened around them, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since that night 8 years ago. The stirring of genuine hope. The next morning brought a transformation that defied natural law. Sarah woke before dawn to find Thomas standing at their kitchen window, his silver-traced burns gleaming in the pre-dawn darkness as he watched something that made her breath catch in her throat. The fields were changing. Where yesterday there had been cracked earth and withered stalks, green shoots now pushed through the soil with impossible vigor. Not just growth, resurrection. The land itself was responding to the compact Sarah had helped forge, to the bridges they were building between human need and elemental power. It's starting, Thomas said, his voice carrying those new harmonics that seemed to speak directly to her bones. Can you feel it? The mountain is waking up. Sarah joined him at the window and immediately understood what he meant. There was a pulse in the air, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat but felt infinitely older. The very foundations of Thornhaven were shifting, not physically but spiritually, as forces that had slumbered for 8 years began to stir. By full sunrise, word had spread through the remaining population. People emerged from their homes to witness the impossible. Cornstalks climbing skyward with audible creaks, apple trees budding out of season, water beginning to seep from springs that had run dry months ago. But with the wonder came a fresh wave of terror from those not yet ready to accept what salvation actually looked like. It's unnatural, Mrs. Patterson whispered to her neighbor, loud enough for Sarah to hear as she walked toward the town square. Mark my words, this is just the beginning. First our crops, then what? Our children? Our souls? The fear was spreading faster than the healing, Sarah realized with growing alarm. For every family like the Brennans, who stood in grateful tears as their dying daughter sat up and asked for breakfast, there were 2 others backing away in horror from the supernatural abundance blooming around them. The crisis came at midday. Sarah found Kira in the cemetery, kneeling beside a grave marker so old the name had worn away to illegible scratches. The Thornkeeper was speaking in that dual language Thomas had described, human words woven through with sounds that made the grass shimmer and bend toward her voice. Your great-grandmother, Kira said without looking up. She was the last human who fully understood what I was, what my family represented. Her fingers traced the weathered stone with infinite gentleness. She died defending us when the fear first took hold. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. That's why you came back, not just for the compact, for her, for the debt they owed your family. For the love that was forgotten, Kira corrected, finally meeting Sarah's gaze. She promised that Thornhaven would remember, that her descendants would honor what their ancestors had sworn to protect. A bitter smile touched her perfect lips, another broken promise to add to the collection. Around them, the cemetery was transforming. Flowers bloomed on graves that hadn't seen color in decades. Trees straightened their twisted branches toward the sun. The very dead were being honored by powers that recognized no distinction between life and rest, only the continuity of respect across time. But the beauty was shattered by the sound of approaching voices, angry, frightened, growing closer. She's corrupting hallowed ground, Elder Davies's voice, but changed now, carrying an edge of desperate madness. The fire that had burned away his righteousness had left something unstable in its wake. First our crops, now our sacred dead. Sarah turned to see a crowd gathering at the cemetery gate, led by Davies, but driven by the Hendricks family, the Pattersons, others whose fear had curdled into rage overnight. They carried tools, shovels, pitchforks, lengths of rope, the instruments of another expulsion, another casting out. 8 years ago wasn't enough, Davies continued, his reformed understanding collapsing under the weight of change too vast to accept. We should have buried this evil permanently. Thomas appeared at Sarah's shoulder, moving with that uncanny grace his transformation had granted him. They're going to force the choice, he said quietly. Today. Now. Kira rose from her grandmother's grave with fluid inevitability, and Sarah watched the air around her begin to thicken with power barely contained. The children materialized, from shadow and possibility, all 7 of them, their alien features sharp with protective fury. The mountain itself seemed to lean forward, waiting. Choose, Thornhaven, Kira called out, her voice carrying to every corner of the valley. I am what I have always been, guardian, translator, bridge between your world and forces you cannot survive without. Accept what I offer, or face what comes after. The crowd hesitated, caught between the tools in their hands and the impossible abundance blooming around them. In that moment of suspended possibility, Sarah felt the weight of everything converging. 8 years of exile, generations of broken promises, the fundamental question of whether redemption required forgiveness or could exist alongside justified anger. The mountain held its breath. The choice hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. And Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between the crowd and their salvation, ready at last to finish what they had started. The space between heartbeats stretched into eternity as Sarah faced the crowd, their makeshift weapons gleaming in the unnatural light that surrounded Kira's children. Behind her, she felt the Thornkeeper's ancient power coiling like a spring wound to breaking, while ahead, the faces of her neighbors twisted between desperate need and primal terror. Look at yourselves, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the supernatural tension. Look at what you're holding. She gestured toward the tools in their hands. 8 years ago, you drove out a girl who saw too much, spoke strangely, made you uncomfortable. Today, you're preparing to destroy the only force that can save your dying children. It's not natural, Mrs. Patterson shrieked, but her voice cracked with uncertainty as she glanced toward the Brennan family, where young Emily stood healthy and laughing for the first time in months. Thomas moved to Sarah's side, his silver-traced burns pulsing with their own light. Natural according to whom? You've been living on borrowed time for 8 years, watching everything die while telling yourselves it was God's will or bad weather. His transformed voice carried harmonics that made the gathering crowd sway involuntarily. This is what the mountain looks like when it stops being patient with your ignorance. Elder Davies stepped forward, the supernatural fire that had burned away his righteousness leaving something raw and desperate in its wake. We made a mistake 8 years ago, I can admit that now. But this goes too far. She's not offering to help us. She's demanding we surrender our humanity. Your humanity? Kira's voice carried amusement cold as winter wind. What humanity, Elder? The humanity that cast out a frightened child? That chose to let your people starve rather than question your assumptions? That raised weapons against children offering healing? She gestured toward the 7 figures that flanked her, their alien features sharp with protective fury. Show me this humanity you're so eager to preserve. Sarah felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, not just choice, but the fundamental nature of what choice meant. Behind her, power that could reshape the valley waited for direction. Ahead, fear and desperation warred with the growing evidence of salvation blooming from every crack in the earth. The compact she's offering isn't submission, Sarah said, her words carrying to every corner of the cemetery. It's partnership, recognition of what we should have acknowledged generations ago, that our survival depends on forces larger than our understanding. She looked directly at Davies, then at the other faces in the crowd. She's not asking you to stop being human, She's asking you to remember what being human actually means." Young Jake Morrison pushed through the crowd, his carpenter's hands steady despite the supernatural forces swirling around them. "My baby sister died last winter. Fever we couldn't break, medicine that wouldn't come." His voice caught. If this power, whatever it is, can prevent that from happening to someone else's family, how is accepting it a betrayal of anything worth preserving? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah watched something shift in the crowd's collective expression. Not acceptance yet, but the first crack in their unified opposition. The recognition that their choice wasn't between good and evil, but between known death and unknown transformation. Davies raised his hands, still clutching the empty bottle that had held supernatural fire. "And what happens when she decides we're not worthy partners? When our human failings disappoint her again? We'll have surrendered every advantage, made ourselves completely dependent on something we can't control or understand." "You're already dependent on things you don't understand," Thomas said quietly. "Rain, soil chemistry, the migration patterns of insects that pollinate your crops. The only difference is that this force can think, can choose to help you survive your own limitations." Kira stepped forward, and the air around her began to shimmer with barely contained potential. "I offer you the same compact my family honored for 3 centuries before your fear broke it. Partnership, not servitude. Translation between your needs and the powers that can fulfill them. But partnership requires trust, and trust requires courage you've already proven you lack." The mountain itself seemed to lean closer, Sarah realized, as if the very bedrock was waiting for their decision. She could feel Thomas's transformed nature responding to currents of possibility that remained hidden from ordinary perception, could see the 7 children shifting between human appearance and something far more elemental. "Choose now," Kira continued, her voice carrying the weight of geological time. "Not tomorrow. Not next week, when desperation makes the decision easier. Now, while you still have something to offer besides abject surrender." Sarah looked back at her neighbors, at Martha Hendricks clutching her farming tools, at the Morrison family standing together in their shared grief, at Elder Davies, with his supernatural burn still smoking in the mountain air. They stood at the crossroads between extinction and transformation, between the comfortable lie of human supremacy and the terrifying truth of interdependence. The final test wasn't Kira's to give. It was theirs to pass or fail. In the silence that followed, Sarah felt everything they had built over 2 days of careful negotiation hanging in the balance, waiting for Thornhaven to decide whether redemption was worth the price of change. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, a void that seemed to swallow sound itself. Then Elder Davies raised the empty bottle high above his head, his face contorted with something beyond mere fear, the terrible recognition of a man who had glimpsed truth and found it too vast to accept. "No," he said, and the word fell like a stone into still water. "I won't trade one master for another. I won't bow to something that calls itself our salvation while holding our extinction as the alternative." The bottle came down hard against the cemetery gate, shattering with a sound like breaking thunder. Where the glass struck earth, supernatural fire bloomed, not the cleansing flame that had burned away his righteousness, but something hungrier, more desperate. Something that fed on fear and old certainties, rather than consuming them. The flame spread faster than wildfire, racing between the headstones in patterns that hurt to follow with human eyes. Where it touched Kira's healing work, the restored flowers blackened and died. Where it met the children's presence, it flared brighter, fed by the collision between human terror and elemental power. "Davies, you fool!" Thomas lunged forward, but the supernatural fire formed a barrier between them and the spreading destruction. "You don't understand what you're unleashing." But Sarah saw the terrible understanding in the elder's eyes. He knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't ignorance or panic. This was the choice of a man who would rather rule over ashes than kneel before forces beyond his comprehension. The 7 children moved as one entity, their collective consciousness responding to threat with inhuman precision. But as they raised their hands to counter Davies's fire, Sarah realized with growing horror that they weren't trying to extinguish it. They were preparing to meet it with something equally destructive. Stop! The word tore from her throat with desperate force. This is what she means. This is the test. Kira stood perfectly still at the center of the chaos, her expression unreadable as supernatural forces gathered around her like a storm front. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of geological time, the patience of stone worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. 8 years I waited, she said, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. 8 years of watching you choose death over growth, isolation over connection. I offered partnership. You answer with destruction. The children's alien features grew sharper, more terrible in their inhuman beauty. So be it. Let Thornhaven learn what it chose when it cast out its guardians. The mountain itself was responding now, Sarah realized with mounting terror. Cracks appeared in the cemetery's ancient stonework, and from those fissures came a sound like the earth itself groaning in pain. Not earthquake, something far more deliberate. The conscious anger of powers that had been patient for far too long. This isn't justice, Sarah shouted over the growing roar. This is just another broken promise. You said you came back for love, for your grandmother's memory. Would she want this? Kira's perfect composure cracked for just an instant, and in that moment, Sarah saw past the Thornkeeper's terrible authority to the girl who had been driven into the storm 8 years ago. Still there, still hurting, still hoping for something her pride wouldn't let her name. Thomas understood first, his transformed nature picking up currents of possibility that remained hidden from ordinary perception. The children, he said quietly. They're not just responding to threat, they're responding to her pain. Her anger is feeding theirs. Around them, the supernatural fire and elemental fury continued to build, but Sarah saw the pattern now. Not inevitable destruction, but a test that could still be passed, not by choosing sides, but by refusing to let the choice be framed in terms of victory and defeat. She stepped directly into the space between Davies's desperate fire and Kira's gathering storm. The collision of forces should have destroyed her instantly. Instead, something else happened. The supernatural energies met her presence and hesitated, as if recognizing something they hadn't expected to find. Not power like theirs, but something equally ancient, the stubborn human capacity to refuse impossible choices. Neither, Sarah said, her voice somehow carrying over the chaos. Neither submission nor destruction, neither master nor slave. She looked directly at Kira, then at Davies, finally at the crowd of terrified faces watching their world tear itself apart. Partnership means equals. It means the right to say no without facing extinction. It means trust that works both ways. The supernatural forces swirled around her, but she held her ground. Kira, your children are reflecting your anger, not your wisdom. Davies, your fear is destroying the very thing you claim to protect. Her voice grew stronger, more certain. Both of you are so busy proving you're right that you've forgotten what you're actually fighting for. For a moment that felt like eternity, everything balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Then Kira raised her hand, and the 7 children stepped back, their collective fury cooling to watchful tension. Davies's fire continued to burn, but it no longer spread, contained now by its creator's dawning uncertainty rather than supernatural intervention. In the silence that followed, Sarah felt the weight of the mountain's attention settle on them all, ancient, patient, waiting to see if humanity could finally prove itself worthy of the power it so desperately needed to survive. The mountain's attention pressed down like the weight of centuries, and in that supernatural silence, Sarah felt the true cost of what she'd proposed settling around them like frost. Partnership between equals. But what did that mean when one side possessed the power to reshape reality and the other could barely keep their crops alive? Kira's expression was unreadable, her perfect features carved from marble and moonlight. When she finally spoke, her voice carried harmonics that made the cemetery stones resonate like struck bells. Partnership, she repeated, tasting the word as if it were something foreign. You speak of trust that works both ways, Sarah Chen. But trust requires vulnerability from both parties. Her gaze swept over the crowd, over Davies with his dying fire, over Thomas with his silver-traced burns. What vulnerability do you offer? What do you risk in this partnership you demand? The question hung in the air like a blade, and Sarah felt the weight of everyone's attention, human and otherwise, settling on her shoulders. Around them, the supernatural forces had stilled but not dispersed. They waited, coiled like springs, ready to resume their destructive dance at the slightest provocation. "The children," Sarah said quietly, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. "That's what you're really offering, isn't it? Not just healing for our land, guardianship of your children." Kira's composure cracked, revealing something raw and desperate beneath the Thornkeeper's ancient authority. "For 8 years I have been their only anchor to anything resembling humanity. They know the mountain's language, the deep currents of power that flow beneath your valley, but they have never learned to simply be children." The 7 figures stood motionless, their alien features sharp in the cemetery's supernatural light. But as Sarah looked closer, she began to see past their inhuman beauty to something else, the terrible isolation of beings caught between worlds, too powerful for human childhood, too young for the weight of their responsibilities. "They need what only you can give," Kira continued, her voice breaking slightly. "The chance to run through streets without watching the ground bloom beneath their feet, to laugh without making the mountain itself echo their joy, to be held by people who see them as children first, guardians second." Thomas stepped forward, his transformed nature resonating with the children's otherworldly presence. "And in return?" "In return, Thornhaven becomes what it was always meant to be, a bridge between worlds, a place where human wisdom and natural power work in true partnership." Kira's eyes met Sarah's with desperate intensity. "But it means accepting responsibility for beings you cannot fully understand or control. It means raising children who might outlive your great-grandchildren, who carry powers that could reshape your valley with an angry thought." Elder Davies had gone ashen, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. "You're asking us to become their prisoners, to shape our entire community around the needs of creatures that aren't even human?" Kira's voice turned cold again. "No more than you asked me to become something other than myself 8 years ago. No more than you've asked your own children to sacrifice their futures for your dying traditions." Sarah felt the terrible logic of it settling into place. The price of survival wasn't just accepting help, but accepting responsibility for the helpers themselves. The partnership Kira offered wasn't a transaction but a transformation, one that would change Thornhaven as fundamentally as the children's presence was already changing the land. "There's more," she said, reading the deeper truth in Kira's expression. "Tell them the rest." Kira closed her eyes, and for a moment she looked impossibly young, not the ageless Thornkeeper but the girl who had been driven into the storm. "The compact, once made, cannot be broken by human choice alone. Accept my children as your own, and their nature becomes woven into your community's foundation. They will grow with your children, share your triumphs and sorrows, defend your valley against threats you cannot imagine." "And if we fail them?" Martha Hendricks asked quietly. "If our fear proves stronger than our love?" "Then they become what they were always capable of becoming," Kira said simply. "Forces of nature with no human anchor, no reason to consider mortal needs or limitations." She opened her eyes, meeting each face in the crowd. The mountain itself would become their only parent, and its lessons are not gentle ones. The choice crystallized with terrible clarity, not just partnership, but adoption. Not just accepting help, but accepting the responsibility of raising children who carry the power to destroy or heal everything they touched. The compact Kira offered wasn't a contract but a family bond, one that would bind Thornhaven's fate to these otherworldly beings for generations to come. Sarah felt the weight of decision settling on the crowd, saw in their faces the recognition that survival would cost them everything they thought they knew about childhood, community, and the boundaries between human and natural power. The mountain waited, the children waited. And in the supernatural silence of the cemetery, Thornhaven faced the true price of redemption, not just humility, but love brave enough to embrace the unknowable. The silence stretched until Sarah felt it might snap under its own weight. Then Martha Hendricks stepped forward, her weathered hands trembling as she reached toward the nearest child, a girl whose eyes held the deep green of old forest growth. "My grandson died 3 winters past," Martha said quietly. "Fever took him when the medicines wouldn't come through the passes." Her voice cracked. "I've been grandmother to an empty house ever since." The child tilted her head with inhuman precision, studying Martha's face as if reading something written there in a language only she could understand. When Martha's fingers finally made contact, touching the girl's pale cheek, the air around them shimmered with possibility. "She's so cold," Martha whispered, then looked up at Kira with dawning wonder. But not dead cold, like stone in winter that still holds warmth at its heart. Other villagers began to move, tentatively, fearfully, but with growing inevitability. Jake Morrison knelt beside a boy whose silver hair caught moonlight like spun metal. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, found herself face to face with twins whose features shifted subtly between human and something far more ancient. "They're children," Thomas said, his voice thick with recognition. "However else they were made, whatever powers they carry, they're children who have never had anyone but Kira." Sarah watched the careful dance of first contact unfold around her, saw in each interaction the birth of something unprecedented. Not quite adoption, not quite treaty, but a new form of family bond that transcended species entirely. The children responded to gentle touch with careful attention, to soft words with tilted heads and expressions that grew more recognizably human with each passing moment. Elder Davies stood apart from the growing connections, his face ashen with the weight of what he was witnessing. "This is madness," he said, but his voice held defeat rather than conviction. "We're binding ourselves to forces we cannot comprehend." "You're choosing love over fear," Kira replied, and for the first time since her return, her perfect composure cracked completely. Tears traced silver paths down her cheeks as she watched her children, for the first time in 8 years, experience the simple human gift of belonging, something I had begun to believe you were no longer capable of. The moment stretched, fragile and profound, until young Tommy Morrison looked up from where he had been, showing one of the children how to skip stones. "Ma'am," he called to Kira. "Do they have names, the regular kind, I mean?" Kira's laugh was half sob, a sound that made the mountain itself seem to exhale in relief. "They chose names from your grandmother's stories, little one. Names they heard in the wind when she used to read to you on the porch." She gestured to each child in turn. "Rose, who makes things grow. River, who brings the rain. Stone, who makes foundations strong. Star, who guides lost things home. Storm, who clears away what needs clearing. Song, who heals hearts. And Peace, who helps everything remember how to rest." The names settled over the gathering like a blessing, transforming the otherworldly beings into something both magical and achingly familiar. Sarah felt something tight in her chest finally loosen as she watched Rose place her small hand in Martha's weathered palm, as River approached the Morrison family with shy curiosity. "The compact is not just about power," Kira said quietly, addressing the crowd but watching her children with fierce tenderness. "It is about creating something that has never existed before. A community where human wisdom guides elemental force, where natural power serves human flourishing. But it only works if you can see them as what they are, children who happen to carry the mountain's strength, not forces of nature that happen to wear children's faces." Davies made one last attempt at resistance. "And when they grow older, when they come into their full power, then they will remember who taught them about kindness." Thomas answered before Kira could speak. "Who showed them that strength serves best when it protects rather than dominates." His silver-marked hand found Sarah's, their transformed flesh resonating with shared understanding. They will remember that their first lessons in humanity came from people brave enough to love them before understanding them. Sarah looked around the cemetery, seeing her neighbors in a new light, not as the fearful, isolated people who had driven away their guardian 8 years ago, but as the foundation of something unprecedented. A community that could raise children of mountain and storm, that could offer family bonds to beings whose very existence rewrote the rules of possibility. The mountain's presence still pressed against them, ancient and watchful, but its attention had shifted from judgment to something like approval. In the space between headstones, where flowers now bloomed despite the season, where children of two worlds were beginning to know each other's names, Thornhaven found its redemption not in forgiveness, but in the courage to become something entirely new. The compact was forming itself around them, Sarah realized, woven from small acts of acceptance and the revolutionary choice to call these impossible children their own. The compact took hold gradually, like sunrise breaking over the mountain peaks, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Sarah felt it in the way the air itself seemed to brighten, in how the cemetery's ancient stones hummed with renewed purpose. Around her, the careful dance of introduction continued, but something fundamental had shifted in the space between heartbeats. Kira stepped back from the growing connections, her role as intermediary dissolving as naturally as morning mist. For the first time since her return, she looked genuinely uncertain, no longer the terrible Thornkeeper who had emerged from storm and legend, but a young woman watching the only family she had known for 8 years learn to belong to others. "You're afraid," Sarah realized, moving to stand beside her. Up close, she could see the subtle changes that marked Kira's transformation: skin that held an inner luminescence, eyes that reflected depths no human gaze should contain. But beneath the otherworldly alterations, the girl who had been driven into the storm was still there, still vulnerable. "They won't need me anymore," Kira whispered, her perfect voice cracking slightly. "For 8 years, I was their anchor to anything resembling humanity. But now—" She gestured toward where Martha was teaching Rose to braid flowers, where the Morrison family had formed a careful circle around River and Stone. "They'll learn what I never could give them, how to simply be children." Sarah followed her gaze, understanding flooding through her with startling clarity. This was Kira's true sacrifice, not just returning to face the community that had rejected her, but surrendering the exclusive bond that had defined her existence in the hidden realm. The children would always carry her mark, but they would grow beyond it, shaped by human hands and hearts in ways she could never predict or control. "You're not losing them," Sarah said quietly. "You're giving them the chance to become more than even you imagined possible." Around them, the supernatural atmosphere was gradually settling into something warmer, more natural. The children's alien features softened as they responded to gentle touches and patient words. Star giggled, actually giggled, when Tommy Morrison showed her how to make shadow puppets against the cemetery wall. The sound was musical, like wind chimes catching a summer breeze, but recognizably that of a delighted child. Elder Davies approached slowly, his resistance finally crumbling as he watched his own granddaughter offer Song a handful of late-season wildflowers. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice heavy with the weight of acceptance. How do we raise them?" "The same way you raise any child," Kira replied, though Sarah caught the tremor of uncertainty beneath her words. "With patience and love, and the understanding that they'll become something wonderful if you give them room to grow." She paused, watching Peace help elderly Mr. Chen to his feet with strength that should have been impossible in such a small frame. "They'll need structure, boundaries, the chance to learn that power serves best when it protects rather than dominates." "And you?" Thomas asked, his transformed nature allowing him to sense the currents of change flowing around them. "What becomes of the Thornkeeper when her charges have human families to guide them?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah saw Kira's careful composure begin to fracture. For 8 years, she had been defined by her role as guardian and guide to beings caught between worlds. Without that responsibility, who was she? What place did the girl who had been cast out have in the community that was choosing to embrace what she had become? "I don't know," Kira admitted, the words barely audible. "The mountain shaped me for guardianship, but the children no longer need a guardian. They need parents, teachers, friends, human connections I was never equipped to provide." Sarah felt the weight of recognition settle over her as she watched Kira's careful mask slip away completely. Here was the real return. Not the terrible Thornkeeper emerging from legend, but a young woman who had spent 8 years becoming something magnificent and inhuman, only to discover that what she had achieved might no longer be necessary. Then maybe, Sarah said carefully, it's time for you to learn how to simply be Kira again. Not the village outcast, not the mountain's guardian. Just yourself, in a place that's finally ready to accept all of what that means. The suggestions sparked something fragile and hopeful in Kira's expression. Around them, the compact continued to weave itself from small moments of connection, children learning each other's names, adults discovering that love could indeed bridge the gap between human and otherworldly, a community slowly accepting the revolutionary idea that family bonds could transcend the boundaries of species entirely. The mountain's ancient presence still pressed against them, but it felt different now, approving rather than watchful, protective rather than judgmental. In the space between headstones where impossible flowers bloomed and children of two worlds were becoming siblings, Thornhaven found its transformation complete. The girl who had been driven into the storm had returned home at last, not as conqueror or savior, but as family. 3 months later, Sarah found Kira sitting on the porch of the old Hendricks house, watching Rose help Martha tend a garden that bloomed with impossible abundance. The transformation wasn't just in the land anymore. It lived in moments like this, ordinary and extraordinary woven together until you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. She asked me to braid her hair this morning, Kira said without turning around. Her voice had lost its otherworldly perfection, settling into something warmer, more recognizably human. Just like any little girl getting ready for school. Sarah settled beside her, noting how Kira's luminescent skin had softened to something that merely suggested inner light rather than demanding recognition of it. The mountain's mark would always be there, but it no longer defined her entirely. Mrs. Patterson says all 7 of them are adapting remarkably well. Star actually corrected her arithmetic yesterday. Politely. A laugh bubbled up from Kira, genuine and unguarded. Star always was the most diplomatic. River, on the other hand, she gestured toward the sound of delighted shrieks from the schoolyard, where a boy with silver hair was teaching his classmates to make it rain in perfectly controlled drops. Jake Morrison is having interesting conversations about appropriate use of natural phenomena during recess. The scene spread below them like a living testament to the impossible made routine. Storm helped Mrs. Chen carry groceries, his otherworldly strength carefully modulated to human needs. Peace sat in the library reading to elderly residents, her presence easing arthritis and old heartaches without fanfare. Song had become the unofficial healer of playground scraped knees and hurt feelings, her touch as gentle as her name suggested. They're becoming exactly what you hoped, Sarah observed. Children first, guardians second. Kira nodded, but Sarah caught the shadow that crossed her expression. The successful integration of her children into Thornhaven's daily life had left her oddly untethered, no longer defined by her role as their sole connection to humanity. The community had embraced them with a fervor that surprised everyone, desperate affection born from years of loss and the recognition that these impossible children were fundamentally exactly what they appeared to be, children who needed love, guidance, and the chance to simply belong. Thomas stopped by yesterday, Sarah continued carefully. Said the mountain's been quieter lately, more settled. It's satisfied, Kira replied. The compact is holding. The balance between human wisdom and natural power is exactly what it always hoped for. She paused, watching Rose show Martha how to coax flowers into blooming by singing to them. But I think it's also letting go, trusting the community to guide what it can no longer control directly. The implications hung between them, unspoken but understood. Kira's transformation had been the mountain's way of preserving its children, but that preservation was complete now. The otherworldly authority that had defined the Thornkeeper was slowly transferring to the community itself, distributed among dozens of human hearts learning to love beyond the boundaries of species. What will you do? Sarah asked gently. For a long moment, Kira didn't answer. Then she stood, brushing dirt from jeans that were simply jeans now, not the flowing garments of an elemental guardian. Yesterday, Martha asked if I'd help her preserve the late harvest. Just help, not because of what I am, but because I'm here and willing. Her smile was tremulous but real. I think I'd like that, learning to be useful in ordinary ways. Sarah felt something tight in her chest finally release completely. This was what redemption actually looked like. Not forgiveness for past wrongs, but the chance to build something entirely new from the foundations of mutual understanding. Kira would never be the girl who had been driven into the storm, just as Thornhaven would never be the insular community that had cast her out. But what they were becoming together held promise that neither could have achieved alone. "The children will always need you," Sarah said, "just differently than before." "I know." Kira's voice carried quiet confidence now. "But they'll also have what I never had, a whole community to catch them if they fall, to celebrate their victories, to show them that being different doesn't mean being alone." She looked back toward the garden, where Rose was teaching Martha the deep songs that made roots grow strong. That's worth every moment of uncertainty. Evening was settling over the valley, and lights began flickering on in houses that held families no one could have imagined 3 months ago. The mountain stood eternal and protective above them, but its ancient vigilance had transformed into something like contentment. In parlors and kitchens across Thornhaven, 7 children who carried the power to reshape the world were learning to set tables and practice spelling words and argue with their siblings about whose turn it was to feed the cat. The girl who had been cast out had finally found her way home, not to what she had lost, but to what she had never dared to dream possible.